Veteran and his dog. Unearth a 1981 sedan. The Glovebox envelope upends a quiet town overnight. You're about to witness one of the most incredible true stories that will shake you to your core. A Vietnam veteran and his loyal companion are about to make a discovery that will change everything they thought they knew about their peaceful hometown. This is a story of secrets buried for decades, of justice long overdue, and of how the past can reach out and demand to be heard. If you're ready for a journey that will keep you on the edge of your seat, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and ring that notification bell because you won't want to miss a single moment of what's coming next. The morning mist clung to the hills surrounding Millbrook, Tennessee, like a shroud, casting an ethereal glow over the small town that had barely changed since the 1980s. Population 3,247, according to the weathered sign at the town limits, though everyone knew old Mrs. Henderson had passed last winter, making it 3,246. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where secrets were currency and gossip traveled faster than the morning paper. Frank Morrison had been walking these same trails for the better part of 15 years, ever since he'd returned from his second tour in Afghanistan with a Purple Heart, a slight limp, and post-traumatic stress that made crowded places feel like minefields. The Tennessee hills had become his sanctuary, and his German shepherd Duke had become his anchor to the present when the past threatened to pull him under. This particular October morning carried the crisp promise of winter, and Frank pulled his worn military jacket tighter as he navigated the familiar path that wound through the dense oak and maple forest behind his modest cabin. Duke trotted ahead, his black and tan coat gleaming in the filtered sunlight, nose to the ground as he investigated every scent with the thoroughness of a seasoned detective. Frank had rescued Duke from a military working dog program when the shepherd had been deemed too aggressive for continued service. It was a label Frank understood all too well. They'd found each other at a time when both needed rescuing, and in the 5 years since they'd become inseparable. Duke understood Frank's moods better than most humans ever had, sensing when the nightmares were coming, when the crowds became too much, when the world felt too heavy to bear. The trail they followed today was one they'd discovered accidentally about 6 months ago, when Duke had chased a rabbit off the beaten path. It led deeper into the forest than Frank usually ventured, winding through a series of small valleys that seemed untouched by human presence. The local teenagers probably knew about it, Frank figured, but it felt like their own private piece of the world. As they crested a small ridge, Duke suddenly stopped. His ears perked forward in that way that meant he'd found something interesting. Frank paused, watching as the dog's nose worked over time, following an invisible trail that led off to their right, down into a small depression hidden by a thick stand of young pines. "What is it, boy?" Frank asked quietly, his voice carrying the gravelly tone of a man who'd seen too much and spoke too little. Duke looked back at him with those intelligent brown eyes, then bounded down the slope, disappearing into the trees. Frank followed, his boots sliding slightly on the loose leaves that carpeted the forest floor. The depression was deeper than it had appeared from above, forming a natural bowl about 30 feet across. Ancient trees ringed the edges, their massive trunks creating a sense of cathedral-like solitude. It was beautiful, peaceful, and completely hidden from the outside world. Duke was at the far end of the depression, pawing at something beneath a thick layer of fallen leaves and forest debris. As Frank approached, he could see that the dog had uncovered what looked like a piece of rusted metal, barely visible beneath decades of accumulated organic matter. "Good boy," Frank murmured, scratching Duke behind the ears. "What did you find?" Frank knelt down beside the dog and began brushing away leaves with his hands. The metal was definitely automotive, painted a faded blue that had oxidized to an almost gray-green patina. As he cleared more debris, the shape began to emerge, a curved surface that could only be the roof of a car. His heart rate quickened as the implications began to sink in. This wasn't just any abandoned vehicle. The level of debris accumulation, the way the forest had grown around and over it, suggested this car had been here for a very long time. Decades, possibly. Frank stood up and walked around the perimeter of what was clearly a buried automobile, trying to estimate its size and position. Duke followed him, occasionally stopping to sniff at exposed pieces of metal. From what Frank could determine, the car was nose down in the depression, its rear end slightly elevated and almost completely hidden under years of fallen leaves, dead branches, and forest growth. A chill ran down Frank's spine as he realized what he might be looking at. In his 23 years in the military, he'd seen enough to know that cars didn't just disappear into forests by accident. Someone had put this here, and they'd gone to considerable trouble to hide it. Frank pulled out his cell phone, checking for signal bars. One bar flickered weakly, but it was enough. His first instinct was to call the police, but something made him hesitate. Millbrook was the kind of town where information traveled fast, and if this turned out to be what he thought it might be, he wanted to be careful about who knew what when. Instead, he began taking pictures, documenting the scene from every angle he could manage. Duke watched him work, occasionally venturing closer to investigate different parts of the buried vehicle. The dog seemed particularly interested in the area near what Frank estimated was the driver's side door, pawing at the debris with unusual persistence. "What is it, Duke?" Frank asked, making his way over to where the dog was digging. As he knelt down and began clearing leaves and dirt, his fingers encountered something unexpected, a section of the car where the metal was jagged and torn, as if it had been damaged in some kind of impact. The more he uncovered, the more convinced he became that this was no ordinary abandoned vehicle. The damage pattern was consistent with what he'd seen in accident reports during his time as a military police officer: impact damage, specifically the kind that suggested a high-speed collision. Frank sat back on his heels, his mind racing. If this car had been in an accident, where were the accident reports? Why was it buried in the middle of nowhere instead of being towed to a salvage yard? And most troubling of all, how long had it been here? He looked around the peaceful forest clearing, trying to imagine how someone would have gotten a damaged car to this location. The nearest road was at least half a mile away, and the terrain between here and there was rough and heavily forested. It would have taken considerable effort and planning to bring a vehicle here, especially one that had been in an accident. Duke had moved to another section of the car and was pawing at something else. Frank joined him and discovered what appeared to be the rear license plate, almost completely obscured by rust and forest debris. With careful brushing, he managed to expose enough of the plate to make out partial numbers, 427, followed by what might have been Tennessee state identifiers. His hands were shaking slightly as he took pictures of the license plate. This was definitely evidence of something, though he wasn't sure what yet. The responsible thing to do would be to call the sheriff's department and let them handle it. But Frank's military training had taught him to gather intelligence before making decisions, and his instincts were telling him there was more to discover here. Using a dead branch as a makeshift tool, Frank began systematically clearing debris from different sections of the car. Duke seemed to understand what they were doing and began helping, using his paws to move smaller branches and leaves. It was slow work, but gradually more of the vehicle became visible. The car appeared to be a mid-sized sedan from the early 1980s, based on the body style and what little trim remained visible. The paint had long since oxidized to an unrecognizable color, and vegetation had grown through and around various parts of the frame. But what struck Frank most was how deliberately hidden the car seemed to be. This wasn't a case of someone abandoning a broken-down vehicle. This was something that had been intentionally concealed. As the afternoon wore on, Frank found himself completely absorbed in the task of excavation. Duke remained close by, alternately helping with the digging and standing guard, his ears constantly scanning for sounds that might indicate they weren't alone. The forest remained quiet, except for the occasional rustle of small animals and the distant call of a red-tailed hawk. By late afternoon, Frank had managed to expose most of the passenger side of the vehicle and part of the front end. The damage was even more extensive than he'd initially thought, with significant impact damage to the front bumper and hood area. The windshield was completely shattered, though most of the glass had long since disappeared into the forest floor. What really caught his attention, though, was the passenger side door. Unlike the rest of the car, which was heavily corroded, this door appeared to be only partially closed, leaving a gap of several inches. Frank knelt down and peered through the opening, using his phone's flashlight to illuminate the interior. The first thing he saw made his blood run cold. Hanging from the rearview mirror was an air freshener shaped like a pine tree, its green color faded but still recognizable. But it wasn't the air freshener that stopped his heart. It was what was visible in the back seat. Fabric that looked like clothing, dark with age and moisture, but unmistakably human in origin. Frank's hands were trembling as he backed away from the car. His military training kicked in, and he found himself automatically assessing the situation with the detached professionalism of a soldier. potential crime scene, possible human remains, chain of custody issues, need for proper authorities. But underneath the professional assessment, Frank Morrison, the man, was struggling with a growing sense of dread. He'd come to Millbrook to escape from violence and death, to find peace in a quiet town, where the most exciting thing that happened was the annual Corn Festival. Now he was staring at what appeared to be evidence of something that had shattered that peace long before he'd ever arrived. Duke sensed his distress and moved closer, pressing his warm body against Frank's leg in the way he did when he detected signs of PTSD episodes. Frank reached down and scratched the dog's ears, taking comfort in the familiar gesture. "We need to call this in, boy," Frank said quietly. "But first, let's see if we can figure out what we're dealing with." Using his phone's camera, Frank took as many pictures as he could through the gap in the passenger door, trying to document the interior without disturbing anything. The fabric in the back seat was definitely clothing, and there appeared to be other items scattered throughout the car, what might have been a purse, some papers, and something that glinted metallically in the flashlight beam. Frank was just about to call the sheriff's department when Duke suddenly alerted, his body going rigid and his ears pricking forward. The dog was staring intently at something near the front of the car, a low growl rumbling in his throat. "What is it, Duke?" Frank whispered, following the dog's gaze. At first, Frank didn't see anything unusual. Then Duke began moving toward the front of the buried sedan, his nose working overtime. Frank followed, and as they reached what appeared to be the area near the driver's side, Duke began pawing frantically at a section of debris that looked no different from the rest. Frank knelt down and began clearing leaves and dirt from the area Duke had indicated. Almost immediately, his fingers encountered something that wasn't metal or organic matter. It was hard, smooth, and distinctly artificial. More careful excavation revealed what appeared to be a small wooden box about the size of a jewelry box that had somehow ended up outside the car. The box was in remarkably good condition, considering it had been buried in the forest for what appeared to be decades. It was made of a dark wood, possibly walnut, with simple brass hinges that had tarnished to a green patina. There was no lock, just a simple latch that opened easily when Frank tried it. Inside the box, wrapped in what appeared to be plastic, were several items that made Frank's hands shake as he examined them. The first was a photograph, black and white, showing a young woman with shoulder-length blonde hair standing in front of what looked like a downtown storefront. The woman was smiling, but there was something in her eyes that suggested sadness or worry. The second item was a folded piece of paper that appeared to be a letter, written in feminine handwriting. Frank could make out a few words through the plastic. "If something happens to me," and the truth about what really happened. The third item was the most disturbing, a small, tarnished silver locket. Frank didn't open it, but he could see through the plastic that there was an inscription on the back that he couldn't quite make out. Frank sat back on his heels, staring at the contents of the box. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just an abandoned car, it was evidence of something that someone had gone to great lengths to hide, and whoever had buried this car had also hidden this box, perhaps as insurance or as a way to ensure the truth would eventually come out. Duke was still alert, his attention now focused on Frank and the box he was holding. The dog seemed to sense the importance of what they'd found, his usual playful demeanor replaced by the focused intensity he'd displayed during his military service. Frank carefully rewrapped the items and placed them back in the box, then stood up and looked around the forest clearing. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows through the trees. They had been here for hours, and he needed to make a decision about what to do next. His first instinct was still to call the authorities immediately, but something about the letter, about the phrase, "if something happens to me," made him hesitate. If this was evidence of a crime that had been covered up, then there was a possibility that calling the wrong people could result in the evidence disappearing again. Frank pulled out his phone and checked the signal strength. Still one flickering bar, but enough to make a call if he needed to. Instead of calling the sheriff's department, though, he found himself scrolling through his contacts until he found the number for Sarah Martinez, a reporter for the Millbrook Gazette who'd done a story about him when he'd first moved to town. Sarah had struck him as someone who cared about the truth and who might be willing to help him figure out the best way to handle what they'd found. She was also someone who would understand the importance of documenting everything properly before involving law enforcement. Frank took one last look around the forest clearing, memorizing landmarks that would help him find his way back. Tomorrow, he decided, he would call Sarah and ask her to meet him here. Together, they could figure out the best way to handle what appeared to be evidence of a decades-old crime. As Frank and Duke made their way back through the forest toward home, Frank couldn't shake the feeling that they'd stumbled onto something that was going to change Millbrook forever. The quiet town where he'd sought peace was harboring secrets that someone had killed to protect, and now those secrets were clawing their way back to the surface. The box felt heavy in his jacket pocket, its contents representing not just evidence of a possible crime, but the hopes and fears of someone who had died long before Frank had ever heard of Millbrook. Someone who had tried to ensure that the truth would eventually come out, even if they weren't alive to tell it themselves. As they emerged from the forest and Frank's cabin came into view, Duke suddenly stopped and looked back toward the trees they'd just left. The dog's ears were pricked forward, and he was staring intently at something Frank couldn't see. "What is it, boy?" Frank asked, following the dog's gaze. For a moment, Frank thought he saw movement in the shadows between the trees, but when he looked more carefully, there was nothing there, just the wind moving through the branches and the last rays of sunlight filtering through the canopy. Duke continued to stare for another few seconds, then seemed to relax and continued toward the cabin. But Frank noticed that the dog kept looking back over his shoulder as they walked, as if he sensed they were being watched. Inside the cabin, Frank placed the wooden box on his kitchen table and sat down to examine its contents more carefully. Under the warm light of his kitchen lamp, the photograph became clearer. The young woman appeared to be in her early 20s, with kind eyes and a smile that didn't quite hide an underlying sadness. The storefront behind her had a sign that Frank could now make out, Miller's Five and Dime. Frank knew that building. It was still standing on Main Street in downtown Millbrook, though it housed a coffee shop now instead of a Five and Dime store. The photograph had definitely been taken in Millbrook, probably sometime in the late 1970s or early 1980s, based on the woman's clothing and hairstyle. The letter was harder to read through the plastic, but Frank could make out enough to understand that it was some kind of confession or testimony. The handwriting was careful and deliberate, as if the writer had wanted to make sure every word was legible. There were references to what really happened that night and people who need to be held accountable. The locket was the most personal of the three items. Through the plastic, Frank could see that the inscription read, "To Jenny with all my love, M." The silver was tarnished but still beautiful, and Frank could imagine how much it must have meant to whoever had worn it. Frank spent the rest of the evening researching missing persons cases in Tennessee from the late 1970s and early 1980s. The internet made it easier than it would have been years ago, but information from small towns during that era was still spotty. He found several cases of women who had disappeared from the region during that time period, but without being able to read the letter or examine the other evidence more closely, it was impossible to make any connections. That night, Frank's dreams were filled with images of the buried car and the young woman in the photograph. He kept seeing her face, trying to tell him something he couldn't quite understand. Duke, sleeping on the floor beside the bed, whimpered several times during the night, as if he too was troubled by what they'd discovered. Frank woke before dawn, feeling like he hadn't slept at all. Duke was already awake, sitting by the bedroom window and staring out at the forest. When Frank got up and looked out, he could see the first faint rays of sunlight beginning to filter through the trees, but there was something else that caught his attention. Tire tracks in the dirt road that led to his cabin. Frank was certain those tracks hadn't been there the night before. Someone had driven past his cabin during the night, slowly enough to leave clear impressions in the soft earth. The tracks appeared to continue toward the forest, following the same general direction as the trail he and Duke had taken the day before. A chill ran down Frank's spine as he realized the implications. Someone knew about their discovery, and they'd come looking during the night. Whether they'd found the burial site or not, Frank couldn't tell from his cabin, but the fact that someone had been snooping around meant that word had already gotten out somehow. Frank quickly got dressed and grabbed his jacket, making sure the wooden box was still secure in the inside pocket. Duke was at the door before Frank even called him, clearly sensing that something was wrong. As they stepped outside, Frank noticed other signs that someone had been on his property during the night. Footprints in the soft earth near his front porch, and what looked like cigarette butts near the tree line. Whoever had been here had been watching his cabin for some time. Frank felt the familiar tightness in his chest that usually preceded a panic attack, but Duke seemed to sense his distress and pressed close against his leg. The contact helped Frank focus on the present moment instead of spiraling into the memories of combat zones and surveillance. They needed to get back to the burial site immediately, Frank realized. If someone else knew about the car, there was a chance they might try to move or destroy evidence before Frank could get the authorities involved. And if the wooden box he'd found contained evidence of a cover-up, then the people responsible might be willing to do whatever it took to keep their secrets buried. Frank and Duke made their way quickly through the forest, following the familiar trail toward the hidden depression. As they got closer, Frank could hear something that made his blood run cold. Voices. Multiple people were already at the site, and from the sound of it, they were working to uncover more of the car. Frank motioned for Duke to stay quiet and crept closer, using the thick trees as cover. Through the foliage, he could see 3 men working around the buried sedan. 2 of them he didn't recognize, but the third made his heart sink. Deputy Sheriff Tom Bradley, a man Frank knew by reputation as someone who'd been with the Millbrook Sheriff's Department for over 30 years. If Deputy Bradley was here, it meant that official channels were already involved. But the fact that they were working in secret before dawn, without any of the usual crime scene protocols, suggested that this wasn't an official investigation. This was a cover-up in progress. Frank watched as the men systematically searched through the car, removing items and placing them in plastic bags. They worked with the efficiency of people who knew exactly what they were looking for, and Frank got the distinct impression that this wasn't the first time they'd been to this location. One of the men Frank didn't recognize was tall and thin with graying hair, wearing expensive-looking hiking clothes that seemed out of place in the Tennessee forest. The other was shorter and stockier, with the kind of build that suggested he spent time in a gym. Both men moved with the confidence of people who were used to being in charge. Frank's military training told him to observe and gather intelligence before acting, but every instinct was screaming at him to get away from this place as quickly as possible. If these men were willing to tamper with evidence at a potential crime scene, they probably wouldn't hesitate to silence witnesses. Duke seemed to sense Frank's tension and remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the activity in the clearing below. The dog's military training was evident in the way he held himself, alert but motionless, ready to act but waiting for Frank's command. As Frank watched, Deputy Bradley pulled something from the car that made all 3 men stop what they were doing and gather around. Frank couldn't see what it was from his position, but their body language suggested it was important. The tall man in the expensive clothes seemed particularly agitated, gesturing angrily at whatever Bradley had found. After several minutes of heated discussion, the 3 men began working even more frantically, as if they were running out of time. Frank realized with growing dread that they might be planning to move or destroy the entire car, eliminating all evidence that it had ever existed. Frank carefully backed away from his observation position, moving as quietly as possible through the forest. When he was far enough away to avoid being heard, he pulled out his cell phone and called Sarah Martinez. "Sarah, it's Frank Morrison," he said when she answered. "I need you to meet me right away. I've found something that you need to see, but we may not have much time." "Frank, it's barely 6 in the morning. What's going on?" "I can't explain over the phone." "Can you meet me at the coffee shop on Main Street in 20 minutes? And Sarah, bring a camera, a good one." There was a pause before Sarah responded. "This sounds serious." "It is, more serious than anything that's happened in this town for a very long time." "I'll be there in 15 minutes. Frank hung up and looked down at Duke, who was watching him with those intelligent brown eyes that seemed to understand everything. "We're going to need help, boy," Frank said quietly. "I just hope we can trust the right people." As they made their way back toward town, Frank could hear the sound of vehicles starting up in the distance. The men at the burial site were leaving, probably thinking they'd accomplished whatever they'd come to do. But Frank still had the wooden box, and he suspected that its contents were going to be the key to understanding what had really happened in Millbrook all those years ago. Sarah Martinez was already waiting when Frank arrived at the coffee shop, sitting in a corner booth with a large camera bag beside her. She was in her early 30s, with short dark hair and the kind of focused intensity that made her an excellent investigative reporter. She'd moved to Millbrook from Nashville 5 years earlier, drawn by the promise of a slower pace of life. But Frank suspected she sometimes missed the bigger stories of the city. "Do you look like you've seen a ghost?" Sarah said as Frank slid into the booth across from her. Duke settled on the floor beside the table, still alert, but trying to appear casual. "I might have," Frank replied. "Sarah, What I'm about to show you is going to sound unbelievable, but I need you to hear me out. Frank carefully removed the wooden box from his jacket and placed it on the table between them. Sarah's eyes widened as she took in the aged wood and tarnished brass. "Where did you find this?" "In the forest behind my cabin. But it's not just the box, Sarah. There's a car. A sedan from the early 1980s, buried under decades of forest debris, and I think there might be human remains inside." Sarah's professional demeanor immediately sharpened. "Have you called the police?" "That's complicated." Frank proceeded to tell her about the early morning visit to the burial site, about Deputy Bradley and the two men who were tampering with evidence. Sarah listened without interrupting, her expression growing more serious with each detail. When Frank finished his account, Sarah sat back in her chair and stared at the wooden box. "Frank, if what you're telling me is true, we're looking at evidence of a major crime that's been covered up for decades, and if local law enforcement is involved in the cover-up, then we need to be very careful about who we trust," Frank finished. Sarah nodded. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward the box. Frank pushed it across the table to her. Sarah opened it carefully, using a napkin to avoid leaving fingerprints on the contents. Her breath caught as she saw the photograph. "I know her," Sarah said quietly. Frank felt his heart rate spike. "You know her." "Not personally, but I've seen this picture before." Sarah pulled out her phone and began scrolling through photos. "When I first moved to Millbrook, I did a series of articles about local history. Mrs. Henderson, the woman who died last winter, showed me a collection of old photographs from the town's archives." Sarah found what she was looking for and turned her phone toward Frank. It was a newspaper clipping from 1981 with the headline, "Local Woman Still Missing After 3 Weeks." The photograph accompanying the article was the same young woman from the wooden box. "Her name was Jennifer Walsh," Sarah said. "She was 23 years old when she disappeared. According to the article, she was last seen leaving her job at Miller's Five and Dime on October 15, 1981. She never made it home." Frank stared at the newspaper clipping, feeling pieces of a decades-old puzzle beginning to fall into place. "What else does the article say?" "The investigation was led by Sheriff's Deputy Tom Bradley, who concluded that Jennifer had probably left town voluntarily. The case was officially closed after 6 months." The same Tom Bradley who had been at the burial site that morning, tampering with evidence. Frank felt a cold anger building in his chest. He knew. Bradley knew what happened to her, and he covered it up. "It looks that way," Sarah agreed, "but we need more than just suspicion. We need proof." Frank gestured toward the letter in the box. "Maybe we have it. Can you read what that says without removing it from the plastic?" Sarah carefully positioned the letter so that the light from the window illuminated the text through the protective covering. She read silently for several minutes, her expression growing darker as she processed the contents. "Frank, this is a confession," she said finally. "Jennifer wrote this letter as insurance, in case something happened to her. She says she witnessed something on the night of October 12th, 1981. A hit-and-run accident involving a prominent local businessman and a teenage boy on a bicycle. Who was the businessman? She doesn't give a name in the letter, but she says she has evidence, photographs and documentation that prove the accident was covered up." Sarah looked up from the letter. "She was blackmailing someone, Frank, and they killed her for it." Frank felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with high-stress situations. "So whoever killed Jennifer buried her car in the forest and thought they'd gotten away with it. But they didn't know about this box. The question is, who are we dealing with? Jennifer mentions powerful people and connections that go all the way to the top, but she doesn't name names." Frank thought about the two men he'd seen with Deputy Bradley that morning. One of them might still be alive, still in Millbrook, still covering up what they did. Sarah was already reaching for her camera. "We need to document everything before we turn this over to anyone, and we need to be very careful about who we trust." They spent the next hour photographing the contents of the wooden box from every possible angle, making sure to capture all the text of Jennifer's letter. Sarah also made copies of the newspaper clipping and began researching other articles from that time period. "There's something else," Sarah said as she scrolled through archived newspaper articles on her phone. 3 days after Jennifer disappeared, there was another article about a teenage boy named Michael Chen who died in a hit-and-run accident on October 12, 1981. The same date Jennifer mentioned in her letter. Frank leaned forward. "Where did the accident happen?" "County Road 47, just outside town." The boy was riding his bicycle home from work when he was struck by a vehicle that fled the scene. The driver was never found, and Jennifer witnessed it. According to her letter, she was driving home from a date when she saw the accident happen. She says she followed the other car and saw who was driving it. Sarah's face was grim. She tried to do the right thing, Frank. She went to the police with what she'd seen. But instead of investigating, they killed her to keep her quiet. Sarah nodded. And Tom Bradley, who was supposedly investigating her disappearance, was probably the one who made sure the case never got solved. Frank stood up, his military instincts telling him they needed to move quickly. We need to get this information to someone we can trust, someone outside the local law enforcement system. I have a contact at the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, Sarah said. Agent Lisa Crawford. She specializes in cold cases and public corruption. If anyone can handle this properly, it's her. How soon can you reach her? I'll call her right now. Sarah was already dialing the number. Agent Crawford, this is Sarah Martinez from the Millbrook Gazette. I have information about a cold case that I think you need to see immediately. While Sarah talked to the TBI agent, Frank found himself staring out the coffee shop window at the quiet main street of Millbrook. In a few hours, the street would be busy with morning commuters and shoppers, people going about their daily lives in a town they believed was safe and peaceful. They had no idea that their community had been built on a foundation of lies and covered-up crimes. Duke sensed Frank's agitation and pressed closer to his leg, offering the comfort of his warm presence. Frank scratched the dog's ears and tried to focus on the present moment, but his mind kept returning to the image of Jennifer Walsh's face in that photograph. She'd been so young, with her whole life ahead of her. Someone had taken that away from her, and for 44 years they'd gotten away with it. Sarah finished her phone call and turned back to Frank. Agent Crawford is driving down from Nashville right now. She'll be here in 2 hours. She wants to meet us at the burial site, and she's bringing a forensics team. What about Bradley and his friends? If they see TBI agents at the site, Crawford is coordinating with the state police. Bradley will be taken into custody for questioning as soon as the forensics team arrives. Sarah's expression was determined. This ends today, Frank. Jennifer Walsh is finally going to get justice. Frank nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't going to be that simple. People who had been covering up crimes for 44 years wouldn't go down without a fight, and they'd proven they were willing to kill to protect their secrets. As they prepared to leave the coffee shop, Frank noticed a black sedan parked across the street that hadn't been there when they'd arrived. The windows were tinted, making it impossible to see who was inside, but something about the vehicle made Frank's combat-trained instincts fire warning signals. "Sarah," he said quietly, "we're being watched." Sarah followed his gaze to the sedan. "Are you sure? Duke's been alert ever since we sat down, and that car wasn't there when we arrived." Frank kept his voice calm, but his hand instinctively moved to the wooden box. "We need to get out of here, but not together. If they're watching us, they're probably planning to follow us to the burial site. What do you suggest? You go first. Take your car and drive toward the site, but don't go all the way there. Stop somewhere public and wait for Agent Crawford. I'll leave 5 minutes later and take a different route." Sarah nodded and gathered her camera equipment. "Frank, be careful. If these people killed Jennifer, they won't hesitate to kill again." "They can try," Frank said grimly. "But I'm not a 23-year-old woman alone and scared. I'm a combat veteran with a partner who's trained to take down armed suspects." Duke's ears perked up at Frank's tone, and the dog's posture shifted into the alert stance he'd used during their military service. Whatever was coming, they'd face it together. Sarah left first, walking casually to her car and driving away without looking back at the black sedan. Frank waited exactly 5 minutes, then stood up and walked toward the door. As he passed the window, he caught a glimpse of movement in the sedan across the street. Someone was definitely watching. Frank and Duke exited the coffee shop and walked calmly toward Frank's pickup truck, which was parked in the alley behind the building. As they rounded the corner, Frank risked a quick look back and saw the black sedan pulling away from the curb, clearly preparing to follow them. Instead of getting in his truck, Frank continued walking through the alley and out the other side, emerging onto a parallel street. Duke stayed close beside him, alert but appearing casual to any observers. Frank's military training had taught him the value of reconnaissance and misdirection, and he intended to use both now. They made their way through several blocks of residential streets, staying off the main roads where they might be easily spotted. Frank used his knowledge of Millbrook's layout to work their way toward the forest by a circuitous route that would be difficult to follow by vehicle. As they reached the edge of town, Frank's phone buzzed with a text message from Sarah. "TBI team is 30 minutes out. I'm at the park on Elm Street waiting for them. Black sedan followed me for 6 blocks, then disappeared." Frank replied, "Good. I'm approaching the site from the north. We'll observe until backup arrives." They entered the forest through a different trail than the one they'd used the day before, approaching the burial site from an angle that would give them a view of the area without being easily detected. Frank's military experience in reconnaissance made navigating unfamiliar terrain second nature, and Duke followed his lead with the silent efficiency of a trained partner. As they got closer to the site, Frank could hear voices again. The same 3 men from the early morning were back, and they seemed to be working frantically to remove something from the buried car. Frank crept closer, using hand signals to keep Duke in position behind him. Through the trees, Frank could see that the men had managed to expose most of the vehicle's interior. Deputy Bradley was pulling what looked like skeletal remains from the back seat, while the 2 other men worked to dismantle other parts of the car. They were destroying evidence as fast as they could work. Frank's anger flared as he watched them desecrate what was essentially Jennifer Walsh's grave. For 44 years, she'd been lying in this forest while her killers lived free, and now they were trying to erase even the evidence of her existence. Frank pulled out his phone and began recording video of the activity, making sure to capture clear images of all 3 men. Duke remained motionless beside him, every muscle tense and ready for action. The tall man in expensive clothes was becoming increasingly agitated as they worked. Frank could hear fragments of heated conversation. "Should have done this years ago, and can't let that reporter find anything else." It was clear they knew about Sarah's investigation and were trying to eliminate evidence before law enforcement arrived. Frank checked his phone and saw that 25 minutes had passed since Sarah's last text. The TBI team would be arriving soon, but these men might finish destroying the evidence before they got there. Frank had to make a decision: continue observing or intervene to preserve what remained of the crime scene. The decision was made for him when Duke suddenly tensed and growled low in his throat. Someone was approaching their position from behind. Frank spun around to see a 4th man, someone he hadn't seen before, moving through the trees with a hunting rifle in his hands. Frank's combat training kicked in immediately. He signaled Duke to move left while he rolled right, just as the man with the rifle fired a shot that splintered the tree trunk where Frank's head had been moments before. "Duke, attack!" Frank commanded, and the German shepherd launched himself through the underbrush toward the gunman. The man tried to swing his rifle toward the charging dog, but Duke was too fast and too well trained. The shepherd hit him in the chest with the full force of his 80-pound body, sending both the man and his rifle tumbling to the ground. Frank was already moving, using the distraction to close the distance between himself and the gunman. His military hand-to-hand combat training took over as he disarmed the man and secured him with a chokehold that rendered him unconscious within seconds. The gunshot had alerted the 3 men at the burial site, and Frank could hear them crashing through the forest toward his position. He grabbed the rifle and took cover behind a large oak tree, with Duke positioned beside him. "Federal agents are on their way here right now," Frank called out. "You're surrounded. Put down any weapons and surrender." "Like hell we will," came the reply from Deputy Bradley. "You should have minded your own business, Morrison." Frank wasn't surprised that Bradley knew his name. In a town the size of Millbrook, everyone knew everyone, especially a veteran who lived alone in the woods with a military working dog. "Jennifer Walsh deserves justice," Frank called back, "and Michael Chen deserves justice. You've had 44 years to come clean, now it's too late." "Those were accidents," another voice replied. Frank thought it was the tall man in expensive clothes. "Nobody meant for anyone to get hurt." "Bullshit," Frank responded. "You killed a teenage boy and left him to die on the road. Then you killed Jennifer Walsh when she tried to tell the truth about it. Those weren't accidents. They were cold-blooded murder." Frank could hear the men moving through the forest, trying to flank his position. His military experience told him they were poorly trained and making too much noise, but they had him outnumbered, and they knew the terrain as well as he did. Duke was alert beside him, ears pricked and ready to move on command. The dog's presence was reassuring, but Frank knew they were in serious danger. These men had killed before and were clearly willing to kill again to protect their secrets. Frank's phone buzzed with an incoming call from Sarah. "Frank, TBI is here. Agent Crawford and 6 state troopers are moving toward your position from the south. Are you okay?" "Negative," Frank replied quietly. We're pinned down about 200 yards north of the burial site. 4 suspects, at least 1 rifle. Tell Crawford to approach from the east and watch for an ambush. Copy that. Help is coming. Frank could hear vehicles approaching through the forest, and the sound seemed to panic the men who were trying to surround him. Their movements became more erratic and desperate. "This is Agent Crawford, Tennessee Bureau of Investigation," came a voice amplified by a bullhorn. "You are surrounded by federal agents and state police. Put down your weapons and surrender immediately." The response was a rifle shot fired in the direction of Agent Crawford's voice. Frank heard someone scream, "Officer down!" and realized the situation had just escalated into a full-scale firefight. Frank made a tactical decision. Using the chaos as cover, he moved from his concealed position toward the burial site, with Duke following close behind. If the men were distracted by the arriving law enforcement, this might be his best chance to preserve whatever evidence remained. As they approached the clearing, Frank could see that the 3 men had abandoned their efforts to destroy evidence and were now focused entirely on escape and survival. The tall man in expensive clothes was trying to reload an old hunting rifle, while Deputy Bradley provided cover with a service pistol. Frank recognized the 3rd man now, James Richardson, who owned the largest construction company in Millbrook and served on the town council. Richardson was the one who'd been dismantling parts of the car, and he was now trying to set fire to the skeletal remains they'd removed. "Duke, stop him," Frank commanded, pointing toward Richardson. The German shepherd sprinted across the clearing and leaped at Richardson just as he was lighting a match. The impact sent both Richardson and the match flying, and the fire never caught. Frank used Duke's attack as a distraction to close with Deputy Bradley, who was so focused on the dog that he didn't see Frank approaching from his blind side. Frank tackled the deputy and wrestled the pistol away from him, then held him at gunpoint while Duke kept Richardson pinned to the ground. The tall man with the rifle had disappeared into the trees, probably trying to escape before the TBI agents could surround the area completely. Frank could hear gunfire in the distance, and he hoped Agent Crawford and her team were able to apprehend him without anyone getting seriously hurt. Within minutes, the clearing was swarming with federal agents and crime scene technicians. Agent Crawford approached Frank's position carefully, her weapon drawn but pointed in a safe direction. "Mr. Morrison? I'm Agent Crawford. Are you injured?" "No, ma'am. Duke and I are fine, but you'll want to secure these 2 carefully. They've been destroying evidence for the past hour." Crawford nodded and signaled for her team to take Bradley and Richardson into custody. "We got the 3rd suspect trying to escape in a vehicle, and the 4th one, the shooter, is in custody thanks to your intervention." Frank holstered the pistol he'd taken from Bradley and looked around the devastated crime scene. Despite the suspect's efforts to destroy evidence, there was still enough remaining to tell Jennifer Walsh's story. Her car, her remains, and most importantly, the wooden box that contained her final testimony. "Agent Crawford," Frank said, pulling the box from his jacket. "This contains a letter from the victim, written before she was killed. It explains what she saw and why she was murdered." Crawford accepted the box with gloved hands and examined its contents carefully. As she read Jennifer's letter, her expression grew increasingly grim. "Mr. Morrison, do you realize what you've uncovered here? This isn't just a 44-year-old murder case. This is evidence of a conspiracy involving local law enforcement, elected officials, and business leaders. The cover-up goes all the way to the top of Millbrook's power structure." Frank nodded. "Jennifer Walsh tried to do the right thing, and they killed her for it. She deserves justice, and so does Michael Chen." "They'll get it," Crawford said firmly. "I can promise you that." As the crime scene technicians began their methodical documentation of the burial site, Frank and Duke finally allowed themselves to relax. The wooden box was in the hands of people who would ensure its contents saw the light of day, and the men responsible for Jennifer's death were in custody. But Frank knew this was just the beginning. Jennifer's letter had mentioned powerful people and connections that go all the way to the top. The 4 men they'd arrested today might just be the tip of the iceberg. Sarah Martinez appeared at the edge of the clearing, her camera documenting everything for what would undoubtedly be the biggest story in Millbrook's history. When she saw Frank, she rushed over to make sure he was unharmed. "Are you okay? I heard gunshots." "We're fine," Frank assured her. "Duke and I have been through worse than this." Sarah looked around at the activity in the clearing. Federal agents, state police, crime scene technicians, and the partially excavated car that had been Jennifer Walsh's tomb for 44 years. "Frank, You realize you've just blown the lid off the biggest scandal in this town's history? When this story breaks, nothing in Millbrook will ever be the same. Frank thought about the quiet town he'd chosen as his refuge from the violence and trauma of war. He'd come here seeking peace, but instead, he'd uncovered evidence of crimes that had been poisoning the community for decades. Maybe that's not such a bad thing, he said finally. Maybe it's time for Millbrook to face the truth about its past. As the sun began to set through the trees, casting long shadows across the crime scene, Frank reflected on the events that had brought him to this moment. He'd been walking these trails with Duke for years, seeking solitude and healing in the quiet beauty of the Tennessee forest. He'd never expected to become the instrument of justice for a young woman who'd been silenced before he'd ever heard of Millbrook. Agent Crawford approached him as the crime scene work continued around them. "Mr. Morrison, I want you to know that your actions today probably saved this case. If you hadn't found that box and preserved its contents, these men might have succeeded in destroying all the evidence." "I was just walking my dog," Frank replied. "Duke's the one who found everything." Crawford smiled and reached down to scratch Duke behind the ears. "Good boy. You've done your country proud, both of you." As they prepared to leave the forest, Frank took one last look at the burial site where Jennifer Walsh had lain hidden for so many years. Tomorrow, her remains would be treated with the dignity and respect she deserved, and her story would finally be told. The truth she'd tried so hard to preserve would see the light of day, and the men who'd silenced her would face justice. Duke seemed to sense that their work here was done. The dog looked up at Frank with those intelligent brown eyes, then turned toward the trail that would take them home. They'd come to these woods seeking peace, and they'd found something else entirely, the chance to right a decades-old wrong and bring closure to a family that had spent 44 years wondering what had happened to their daughter. Frank Morrison had served his country with honor in Afghanistan, earning a Purple Heart and the respect of his fellow soldiers. But as he walked through the Tennessee forest with his faithful companion, he realized that his most important service might have been helping Jennifer Walsh find her voice again after all these years of silence. The quiet town of Millbrook would never be the same, and that was exactly as it should be. Some secrets were too dangerous to keep buried, and some truths were worth fighting for, no matter how long it took for them to surface. As Frank and Duke emerged from the forest and headed toward home, Frank's phone rang with a call from a number he didn't recognize. "Mr. Morrison? This is District Attorney Patricia Williams from the state of Tennessee. I understand you've uncovered evidence in a decades-old murder case that may have far-reaching implications. I need to speak with you immediately about what you've found." Frank looked down at Duke, who was watching him with alert eyes. Their quiet life in the Tennessee hills was about to become very complicated indeed. 3 weeks after the discovery of Jennifer Walsh's remains, Millbrook was a town transformed. The story had made national headlines, drawing reporters from major networks and newspapers who descended on the small community like an occupying army. The quiet main street where Frank had first met with Sarah Martinez was now crowded with news vans and out-of-town journalists, all trying to understand how such a massive cover-up could have persisted for over 4 decades. Frank had become a reluctant celebrity, though he'd refused most interview requests and tried to maintain his privacy. Duke had become famous too, with several news outlets dubbing him the hero dog who solved a cold case. Frank found the attention overwhelming, but he understood its importance. Jennifer Walsh's story needed to be told, and the more people who heard it, the harder it would be for similar crimes to be covered up in the future. The wooden box and its contents had become the centerpiece of what prosecutors were calling one of the largest corruption cases in Tennessee state history. Jennifer's letter had provided a roadmap that led investigators to a web of connections involving not just the 4 men arrested at the burial site, but also a former mayor, 2 judges, and several prominent businessmen who had helped orchestrate the cover-up over the years. District Attorney Patricia Williams had set up a task force specifically to investigate what the media had dubbed the Millbrook conspiracy. The evidence Jennifer had gathered before her death, combined with Frank's documentation of the burial site and the admissions made by some of the conspirators, had given prosecutors a strong foundation for their case. Frank was sitting on his front porch with Duke, watching the sunset paint the Tennessee hills in shades of gold and crimson, when Sarah Martinez's car pulled into his driveway. She'd been his primary contact with the outside world throughout the media circus, helping him navigate interview requests and keeping him informed about the progress of the investigation. "How are you holding up?" Sarah asked as she climbed the porch steps. Duke greeted her with a tail wag, but remained close to Frank's side. "Some days are better than others," Frank replied honestly. "The attention is hard to deal with, but I keep thinking about Jennifer Walsh and her family. They deserve to have her story told." Sarah settled into the chair beside him and pulled out a folder thick with documents. "That's actually why I'm here. The Walsh family wants to meet with you. Jennifer's younger sister, Margaret, flew in from California yesterday. She'd like to thank you personally for finding her sister and bringing her killers to justice." Frank felt a familiar tightness in his chest. Meeting Jennifer's family would make the case feel even more personal than it already did, but he knew it was the right thing to do. "When and where?" he asked. "Tomorrow afternoon, if you're up for it, at the funeral home where Jennifer's remains are being prepared for burial. Margaret wants to see where her sister was found, but she's not ready to go to the forest site yet. She thought meeting at the funeral home might be easier for both of you." Frank nodded. "I'll be there." Sarah's expression grew more serious. "Frank, there's something else you need to know. The investigation has expanded beyond what anyone expected. Jennifer's letter mentioned photographs and documentation that she'd hidden somewhere, evidence of the original hit-and-run that killed Michael Chen. The FBI has been searching for those materials, and they think they might have found them." "Where?" "Jennifer's old apartment building is still standing downtown. The current owner agreed to let the FBI search the basement storage areas. They found a safety deposit box hidden behind a false wall, along with several other items that Jennifer apparently placed there shortly before she was killed." Frank leaned forward, his attention fully focused. "What kind of items?" "Photographs of the vehicle that killed Michael Chen, including clear shots of the license plate and damage to the front end. Documentation showing that the vehicle was registered to James Richardson's construction company, and a recording device with what appears to be a conversation between Richardson and Deputy Bradley discussing how to cover up the accident." Frank felt a surge of admiration for Jennifer Walsh. Even knowing her life was in danger, she'd continued gathering evidence and documenting the conspiracy. Her foresight and courage were going to ensure that justice was finally served. "There's more," Sarah continued. "The recording device also contains conversations involving the former mayor and at least 2 other people whose voices haven't been identified yet. The FBI thinks this conspiracy went much deeper than anyone realized, and that there may have been other victims over the years." "Other victims?" "The task force is reviewing unsolved disappearances and suspicious deaths in the region going back to the 1970s. Jennifer's letter suggests that the hit-and-run cover-up was just the beginning, and that the same network of corrupt officials may have been involved in other crimes." Frank stared out at the peaceful Tennessee hills, trying to process the magnitude of what Jennifer had uncovered. A young woman working at a five-and-dime store had stumbled onto evidence of a conspiracy that had apparently operated for decades, silencing anyone who threatened to expose the truth. How many people do they think were involved overall? The current estimate is at least 15 people in positions of authority, and possibly more. The conspiracy included law enforcement, elected officials, judges, and business leaders. They had the power to control investigations, manipulate evidence, and silence witnesses. Sarah's voice was grim. Jennifer Walsh wasn't their first victim, Frank. She was just the one who left behind enough evidence to finally bring them down. Duke seemed to sense Frank's emotional state and moved closer, resting his head on Frank's knee. The dog's presence was comforting, a reminder that even in the face of such systematic corruption, there were still bonds of loyalty and trust that couldn't be broken. "What happens now?" Frank asked. "The trials are expected to begin early next year. District Attorney Williams thinks the cases could take 2 or 3 years to work through the court system, given the number of defendants and the complexity of the charges." Sarah paused. "She also said she'll probably need you to testify in most of the trials. You're the one who found the evidence and can speak to the chain of custody issues." Frank had expected this, but it didn't make the prospect any less daunting. He'd have to relive the discovery over and over again in courtrooms filled with lawyers, defendants, and media representatives. His quiet life in the Tennessee hills was going to remain anything but quiet for the foreseeable future. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said finally. "Jennifer Walsh spent 44 years waiting for justice. The least I can do is help make sure she gets it." Sarah smiled and reached over to pat Duke's head. You know, there's been talk about giving Duke some kind of official recognition for his role in solving the case. The Tennessee State Police want to honor him as an honorary K-9 officer. Frank looked down at his companion, who was now lying contentedly across both of their feet. What do you think about that, boy? Want to be an official police dog again? Duke's tail thumped against the porch, and Frank took that as approval. As Sarah prepared to leave, she turned back to Frank with one final piece of information. The Walsh family is planning a memorial service for Jennifer next week, after her remains are released. Margaret asked specifically if you and Duke would be willing to attend. She said she wants Jennifer's story to include the part about how two heroes found her and brought her home. Frank felt tears threatening for the first time since this whole ordeal had begun. We'll be there. After Sarah left, Frank remained on the porch with Duke as full darkness settled over the Tennessee hills. The media attention would eventually die down, the trials would run their course, and life in Millbrook would eventually return to some semblance of normalcy. But Frank knew that the town would never be quite the same. Too many secrets had been exposed, too many trusted figures had been revealed as corrupt, and too many families had learned devastating truths about the past. Frank's phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. The caller ID showed Margaret Walsh's name. "Mr. Morrison, this is Margaret Walsh, Jennifer's sister. I hope it's not too late to call." "Not at all, ma'am. I'm glad to hear from you. I wanted to thank you personally for what you've done for our family. For 44 years we've wondered what happened to Jennifer. We never gave up hope that someday we'd learn the truth, but as the years went by, her voice trailed off. Your sister was very brave, Ms. Walsh. The evidence she gathered is what made this case possible. She never stopped fighting for justice, even when she knew her life was in danger. That sounds like Jennifer. She was always standing up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves." Margaret's voice grew stronger. "Mr. Morrison, I know this has been difficult for you, having your privacy invaded and your life disrupted. But I want you to know that you've given our family something we thought we'd lost forever, the truth about what happened to our sister." Frank found himself struggling to respond. Throughout his military career and his struggles with PTSD, he'd often felt like his service hadn't made much of a difference in the larger scheme of things. But bringing Jennifer Walsh home had given him a sense of purpose that he hadn't felt in years. "I'm just glad Duke and I could help," he said finally. "Duke is the dog who found her, right? I'd like to meet him too, if that's okay. I brought something for him from California. He'd like that. Duke's pretty good with people, and he seems to understand when something's important." After they hung up, Frank looked down at Duke, who was still lying across his feet. "Looks like you're going to be meeting a lot of new people, boy. Think you can handle being famous?" Duke's tail thumped again, and Frank took that as another yes. The next afternoon, Frank drove into downtown Millbrook with Duke riding shotgun in his pickup truck. The media circus had died down somewhat, but there were still reporters stationed around town, hoping to catch interviews with key figures in the case. Frank had learned to avoid the main streets where the news vans congregated, taking back roads and alleys to get where he needed to go. The Miller Funeral Home was a stately brick building that had served Millbrook for over a century. Frank had attended services there for several of his neighbors over the years, but he'd never been inside under circumstances quite like these. Margaret Walsh was waiting in the lobby when Frank and Duke arrived. She was a woman in her early 60s, with graying blonde hair and the same kind eyes that Frank recognized from Jennifer's photograph. She was accompanied by a man about the same age who introduced himself as her husband, David. "Mr. Morrison," Margaret said, extending her hand. "Thank you so much for coming. Please call me Frank, and this is Duke." Margaret knelt down to Duke's level, and the dog approached her with the gentle demeanor he reserved for people who were grieving. She scratched his ears and spoke to him in the soft voice people used with children and animals. "Hello, Duke. Thank you for finding my sister and bringing her home." Duke seemed to understand the gravity of the moment, sitting quietly while Margaret petted him and allowing her to take comfort in his presence. "Would you like to see her?" Margaret asked Frank. "The funeral director said she's been prepared for viewing, if you're comfortable with that." Frank nodded, though he wasn't sure he was ready to see Jennifer Walsh's remains after 44 years in the forest. Margaret led him and Duke down a quiet hallway to a small viewing room, where a simple wooden casket sat surrounded by flowers. Margaret had chosen to display the photograph from the wooden box beside the casket, along with other pictures of Jennifer from her childhood and teenage years. Frank found himself staring at the images of a young woman who'd never had the chance to grow old, to marry, to have children, to see how her courage in the face of danger had eventually led to justice. "She would have been 67 this year," Margaret said quietly. "I used to imagine what she'd look like now, whether she'd have grey hair like mine, whether she'd have grandchildren to spoil." Frank didn't know what to say to that. There were no words that could give back 4 decades of stolen time. No way to undo the damage that had been done to the Walsh family and to Jennifer herself. "The district attorney showed me Jennifer's letter," Margaret continued. "She was so frightened, but she was determined to do the right thing. That was always Jennifer's way. She couldn't stand to see injustice and do nothing about it. The evidence she gathered is going to put her killers away for the rest of their lives," Frank said. "Her courage wasn't wasted." Margaret nodded, wiping tears from her eyes. "I brought something for Duke, like I mentioned on the phone." She reached into her purse and pulled out a small package wrapped in tissue paper. Inside was a simple dog collar made of brown leather, with a brass nameplate that read, "Duke, Hero Dog." "I had it made by a leather worker in Los Angeles," Margaret explained. "I wanted him to have something to remember Jennifer by." Frank accepted the collar with hands that shook slightly. "That's very kind of you. Duke will be honored to wear it." As Frank fastened the new collar around Duke's neck, the dog sat perfectly still, as if he understood the significance of the moment. The brass nameplate caught the light from the funeral home's windows, and Frank found himself thinking about all the ways that Jennifer Walsh's story had changed his life, and Duke's. They spent another hour at the funeral home, sharing stories about Jennifer and about the investigation that had finally brought her home. Margaret had brought photo albums from Jennifer's childhood, and she showed Frank pictures of her sister as a little girl, as a teenager, and as the young woman who died trying to do the right thing. As they prepared to leave, Margaret took Frank's hands in hers. "Frank, I know this experience has been difficult for you, but I want you to know that you've been an answer to decades of prayers. Our family has been able to find peace because of what you and Duke did." Frank nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility that came with being part of Jennifer's story. She deserved so much better than what happened to her. Yes, she did. But now she has justice, and her story will help make sure this kind of thing doesn't happen to other families. Margaret smiled through her tears. That would mean everything to Jennifer. As Frank and Duke drove home through the Tennessee hills, Frank reflected on how much his life had changed since that October morning when Duke had first led him to the buried Sedan. He'd come to Millbrook seeking peace and solitude, trying to recover from the trauma of war and find a place where he could live quietly with his demons. Instead, he'd found purpose. Jennifer Walsh's story had given him a mission that felt as important as anything he'd done during his military service. He was no longer just a combat veteran struggling with PTSD. He was the man who'd helped bring justice to a family that had waited 44 years for answers. Duke seemed different too, wearing his new collar with the pride of a dog who understood he'd done important work. The German Shepherd had gone from being a military working dog deemed too aggressive for service to being the hero who'd solved one of Tennessee's most notorious cold cases. Frank's phone rang as they pulled into his driveway. The caller ID showed Agent Crawford's number. "Frank, I wanted to give you an update on the investigation. We've identified the other voices on Jennifer's recordings, and we're preparing to make additional arrests next week." "How many more people were involved?" "At least 6 others, including a former state representative and a federal judge who's been on the bench for 30 years. Jennifer's evidence has opened up cases going back decades." Crawford's voice was grim. "We think this conspiracy was responsible for covering up at least 12 other crimes over the years, including 3 other murders." Frank felt a cold chill as the full scope of the corruption became clear. Jennifer Walsh hadn't just witnessed a hit-and-run accident. She'd stumbled onto evidence of a criminal organization that had operated with impunity for decades. What happens to the other victims' families? That's why I'm calling. District Attorney Williams wants to create a victim assistance program specifically for the families affected by this conspiracy. She'd like you to help design the program, given your experience with Jennifer's case and your background in military victim services. Frank looked out at the peaceful Tennessee hills where he'd hoped to live quietly for the rest of his days. What would that involve? Working with the families to understand their needs, helping them navigate the legal process, and serving as a liaison between law enforcement and the victims' advocates. It would be part-time, and you could work from Millbrook most of the time. Frank considered the offer. It would mean staying involved in the case for years to come, continuing to deal with media attention and legal proceedings. But it would also mean helping other families find the kind of closure that Margaret Walsh had finally received. "I'll do it," Frank said. "Jennifer Walsh fought for justice even when it cost her everything. The least I can do is help make sure the other victims get justice too." "Thank you, Frank. I'll have William's office send you the details." After he hung up, Frank sat in his truck for a few minutes, looking at his modest cabin and the forest beyond. His quiet retirement was officially over, but he'd found something better, a way to use his skills and experience to help families who'd been devastated by crimes and cover-ups. Duke was watching him with those intelligent brown eyes, waiting to see what they'd do next. Frank reached over and scratched the dog's ears, feeling the new leather collar that Margaret Walsh had given him. "What do you think, boy? Ready to help some more families find their way home?" Duke's tail thumped against the truck seat, and Frank took that as the enthusiastic yes it undoubtedly was. 6 months later, Frank Morrison stood before the Tennessee State Legislature as they debated the Jennifer Walsh Cold Case Protection Act, a law that would require independent oversight of any investigation involving the disappearance or death of someone who'd reported crimes involving public officials. Frank had been invited to testify about the importance of protecting witnesses and ensuring that evidence couldn't be suppressed by corrupt authorities. Duke sat beside him in the witness chair, wearing his hero dog collar and attracting almost as much attention as Frank's testimony. The hearing room was packed with reporters, victim advocates, and family members of people whose cases might be reopened under the new law. Margaret Walsh sat in the front row, along with the families of Michael Chen and the other victims who'd been identified through Jennifer's evidence. "The young woman whose story brought us here today represents something that should be celebrated in our society," Frank told the legislators. "Jennifer Walsh saw a crime and tried to report it. She gathered evidence and documented the truth, even when she knew her life was in danger. She did everything right, and she was murdered for it." Frank paused, looking around the room at the faces of people who'd been affected by similar crimes. "The Jennifer Walsh Cold Case Protection Act won't bring Jennifer back, and it won't undo the decades of pain her family has endured, but it will make sure that future witnesses have protection, and that evidence can't be buried by people who are supposed to serve justice, not subvert it." The hearing continued for several more hours, with testimony from law enforcement officials, victim advocates, and family members. When it was over, Frank felt confident that the law would pass, creating protections that might prevent other families from experiencing what the Walshes had gone through. As Frank and Duke prepared to leave the state capitol, they were approached by a young woman with dark hair and a press badge from a national news magazine. "Mr. Morrison, I'm Jessica Chen, a reporter with Newsweek. I'm also Michael Chen's niece." Frank felt his heart skip a beat. Michael Chen, the teenage boy whose hit-and-run death had started the chain of events that led to Jennifer Walsh's murder, had been little more than a name in the case files. Meeting a member of his family made the tragedy feel personal in a way that Frank hadn't expected. "I wanted to thank you for everything you've done," Jessica continued. "My uncle was only 16 when he was killed. My family never understood why his case was never solved, why the police seemed so uninterested in finding his killer. Now we know it's because they were protecting the person who killed him." Frank shook her hand, noting that she had the same determined expression he'd seen in photographs of Jennifer Walsh. "Your uncle deserved justice, just like Jennifer did. I'm sorry it took so long. But it finally happened, thanks to you and Duke. And now maybe other families won't have to wait 44 years for answers." As they talked, Frank learned that Jessica had become an investigative reporter specifically because of her uncle's unsolved case. She'd spent years researching corruption in small-town law enforcement, never knowing that the answers she sought were buried in a Tennessee forest with a young woman who'd tried to save her uncle's memory. "I'm writing a book about the case," Jessica told him. "About Jennifer Walsh and my uncle Michael, and about how ordinary people can make a difference when institutions fail. Would you be willing to be interviewed for it?" Frank considered the request. He'd turned down most interview requests over the past months, preferring to let the legal proceedings speak for themselves. But the idea of ensuring that Jennifer's story and Michael's story were told properly by someone who understood the personal cost of corruption appealed to him. "I'll do it," Frank said, "but I want the focus to be on Jennifer and Michael, not on me and Duke. They're the real heroes in this story." Jessica smiled. "I think Jennifer would be proud of what you've accomplished in her name." As Frank and Duke drove home to Millbrook that evening, Frank reflected on how much his life had changed since that October morning when they'd first discovered the buried sedan. He'd become an advocate for victims' families, a consultant on cold case investigations, and a symbol of what one person could accomplish when they refused to let injustice stand. Duke had been certified as an honorary member of the Tennessee State Police K-9 unit and had visited dozens of schools to help children understand the importance of doing the right thing, even when it was difficult. The German Shepherd seemed to thrive on the attention and the sense of purpose that came with his new role. Frank's cabin had become a gathering place for families affected by the Millbrook conspiracy, a place where they could find support and understanding from someone who'd been through the process of seeking justice. Margaret Walsh visited regularly, and she'd become like family to Frank and Duke. The trials were ongoing, with convictions already secured against Deputy Bradley James Richardson and 6 other conspirators. The former mayor had pled guilty in exchange for his testimony against the federal judge and state representative who'd been indicted for their roles in the cover-up. It was expected that all the defendants would receive significant prison sentences. Most importantly, 12 other cold cases had been reopened, based on evidence found in Jennifer's hiding place, and several families had finally received answers about the disappearances or deaths of their loved ones. The ripple effects of Jennifer Walsh's courage were still spreading decades after her death. As Frank pulled into his driveway, he noticed a familiar car parked near his front porch. Agent Crawford was sitting on the steps, scratching Duke's ears as if she'd been waiting for them to return. "Agent Crawford," Frank said, as he climbed out of his truck. "Is everything okay?" "More than okay," Crawford replied, standing up with a smile. "I wanted to give you some news in person. The federal judge who was indicted last month just agreed to cooperate fully with our investigation. His testimony is going to help us identify corruption networks in 3 other states." Frank felt a mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion. Each new development in the case brought justice closer for more families, but it also meant the investigation would continue to expand, requiring more time and energy from everyone involved. "That's good news," Frank said. "How many more cases do you think we're looking at?" "Potentially dozens. This conspiracy appears to have had connections to similar networks across the Southeast." Jennifer Walsh didn't just document crimes in Millbrook. She uncovered evidence of a regional corruption ring that's been operating for decades. Duke had been listening to their conversation with the alert expression he wore when he sensed something important was happening. The dog seemed to understand that his role in exposing the conspiracy had made him part of something much larger than a single cold case. Crawford reached into her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "There's something else I wanted to show you. We've been getting letters from families all over the country, people who've read about Jennifer's case and think their own cold cases might be connected to similar corruption." Frank accepted the folder and flipped through dozens of letters, each one representing a family that had been searching for answers for years or decades. The stories were heartbreakingly similar. Investigations that went nowhere, evidence that disappeared, witnesses who were intimidated into silence. "What are we supposed to do with all of these?" Frank asked. "That's what I wanted to talk to you about. The Department of Justice is considering creating a national task force specifically to investigate cold cases involving potential law enforcement corruption. They want you to head up the victim advocacy component." Frank sat down heavily on his porch steps, feeling the weight of the request. He'd already committed to helping with the Tennessee cases, but this would mean traveling across the country, working with dozens of law enforcement agencies, and dealing with hundreds of grieving families. "I don't know if I'm qualified for something that big," Frank said honestly. "Frank, you're the person who refused to let Jennifer Walsh's case be buried a second time. You're the one who figured out how to navigate the corruption and get the evidence to people who could act on it. And you're the one who's been helping families heal while their cases work through the legal system." Crawford's voice was earnest. "You're exactly the person we need for this job." Frank looked down at Duke, who was sitting beside him with that steady, patient expression that had gotten them through so many difficult situations. The dog had been his anchor during the darkest days of his PTSD, and he'd become Frank's partner in seeking justice for people who'd been forgotten by the system. "What would Duke's role be?" Frank asked. Crawford smiled. "Duke would be the first official therapy dog assigned to a federal cold case task force. His job would be to provide comfort to victims' families and to help with evidence detection when needed." Frank scratched Duke's ears and considered the offer. It would mean leaving behind the quiet life he'd built in Millbrook, but it would also mean helping families across the country find the kind of closure that Margaret Walsh had finally received. How long would the assignment be? Initially, 3 years, but it could be extended based on the success of the program and the number of cases that come forward. Frank thought about Jennifer Walsh and the letter she'd written, hoping that someday someone would find her evidence and act on it. She'd never imagined that her courage would inspire a national effort to expose corruption and bring justice to forgotten victims. "I'll do it," Frank said finally, "but I have conditions." "Name them." "First, Margaret Walsh gets to be involved in designing the victim advocacy protocols. She understands better than anyone what families go through during these investigations. Second, the task force has to commit to seeing cases through to completion, not just opening them and then abandoning them if they get complicated. And third, Duke and I work as a team. We don't get separated." Crawford nodded. "All of those conditions are acceptable. When can you start?" "After Jennifer's memorial statue is unveiled next month. I promised Margaret I'd be there for that." The town of Millbrook had voted to erect a memorial statue to Jennifer Walsh in the courthouse square, with an inscription that read, "In memory of Jennifer Walsh, who died seeking truth and justice for others. Her courage reminds us that ordinary people can change the world." The statue would be accompanied by a small garden where people could sit and reflect on the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it's dangerous. As Crawford prepared to leave, she turned back to Frank with one final piece of information. "There's something else you should know. The Walsh family is establishing a foundation in Jennifer's name to provide support for families of crime victims. Margaret asked if you'd be willing to serve on the board of directors." Frank felt a surge of pride for the woman he'd never met, but whose courage had changed his life. Even in death, Jennifer Walsh was continuing to help people find justice and healing. "Of course I will," Frank said. That evening, as Frank and Duke sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the Tennessee hills in shades of gold and orange, Frank reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. He'd come to Millbrook as a broken veteran seeking peace, and he was leaving as an advocate for justice with a mission that would take him across the country. The quiet life he'd planned was gone, but in its place he'd found something better, a purpose that honored the memory of a young woman who died trying to do the right thing, and a chance to help other families find the truth that had been hidden from them for so long. Duke seemed to sense Frank's contemplative mood and moved closer, resting his head on Frank's knee. The dog's new collar caught the last rays of sunlight, the brass nameplate reading Duke Hero Dog, serving as a reminder of how far they'd both come since that October morning in the forest. Frank's phone buzzed with a text message from Margaret Walsh. "Frank, I just heard about your new assignment with the task force. Jennifer would be so proud to know that her story is helping families across the country. Thank you for keeping her memory alive." Frank smiled and typed back, "Thank you for trusting Duke and me with her story. We'll make sure her legacy continues to grow." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky above Millbrook, Frank made a mental list of everything he needed to do before leaving for his new assignment. He'd need to arrange for someone to look after his cabin, pack his belongings, and say goodbye to the town that had become his home. But most importantly, he'd need to visit Jennifer Walsh's grave one more time, to tell her that her evidence was continuing to help people find justice, and that her courage was inspiring a new generation of advocates to stand up for truth. Frank looked down at Duke, who was watching him with those intelligent brown eyes that had first led him to the buried Sedan in the forest. "Ready for another adventure, boy?" Frank asked. Duke's tail thumped against the porch decking, and Frank knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they'd face them together. They'd started as a broken veteran and a rejected military dog, but they'd become something more, partners in the pursuit of justice, guardians of truth and living proof that ordinary people can make an extraordinary difference when they refuse to let injustice stand. The peaceful town of Millbrook had taught them that some secrets are too dangerous to keep buried, and some truths are worth fighting for no matter how long it takes. Now it was time to take that lesson to families across the country who were still waiting for their own Jennifer Walsh to be found, and their own buried truths to see the light of day. So as Frank and Duke prepared to close this chapter of their lives and begin a new one, Frank felt Jennifer Walsh's presence in the Tennessee evening air, a reminder that justice delayed is not justice denied, and that sometimes the most important discoveries come from the most unexpected places. The quiet veteran and his faithful dog had uncovered more than just a buried car and a wooden box of evidence. They discovered that healing comes not from running away from pain, but from turning that pain into purpose, and that the greatest service anyone can provide is to ensure that the voices of the silenced are finally heard. Their story would continue in courtrooms and case files across the country, but it would always begin in a peaceful forest in Tennessee, where a dog named Duke led his human partner to a discovery that changed everything they thought they knew about justice, truth, and the power of ordinary people to make a difference in the world. And in the years that followed, whenever someone asked Frank Morrison what had inspired him to dedicate his life to helping victims' families find justice, he would tell them about a young woman named Jennifer Walsh, who had died trying to do the right thing, and whose courage had taught him that some fights are too important to abandon, no matter how long they take or how difficult they become. That was Jennifer's legacy, and it would live on in every case Frank and Duke helped solve, every family they helped heal, and every truth they helped bring to light. She had wanted her story to make a difference, and 44 years after her death, it was changing the world in ways she never could have imagined. As the last light faded from the Tennessee sky, Frank Morrison and Duke headed inside their cabin, ready to pack for a journey that would take them far from the quiet hills of Millbrook, but would carry Jennifer Walsh's memory with them wherever they went. Their work was far from over, but they'd proven that with courage, determination, and an unshakable commitment to truth, even the most carefully buried secrets could be brought into the light. The veteran and his dog had found their calling, and they would spend the rest of their lives making sure that no family would have to wait 44 years for justice, and no victim would be forgotten as long as they had the strength to keep fighting for the truth.